Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. Our guest today is Buddy Levy. Buddy is an American author, journalist, world traveler, and has been a professor at Washington State University for more than 30 years. His writing focuses on epic tales of adventure and stories of survival. He joins me today to talk about his career as a writer and his latest book called Realm of Ice and Sky: Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue. Buddy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I heard that your father grew up having never seen snow and somehow became a Winter Olympian. Could you tell me how he managed to do that?
Yeah, that's quite a remarkable story. He actually grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. So he may have seen some sleet or freezing rain at some point, but he ended up, when he was about 16, one of his uncles had moved out to Montana, and he spent some time out in Montana, and when he just got completely smitten by trout streams and mountains, and he determined that he wanted to live in and go to college out west. So he ended up going to a college that at the time was called Western State College of Colorado. And he was a really good runner, and he ended up accidentally getting asked to compete in a cross-country ski race because the team needed a member. Someone was sick. And they said, just put these boots on your feet and then the skis on the boots and then kind of run. And he ended up doing really well in the race. And they said, you're on the team. As it turned out, the coach of that team was a man named Sven Vik. And he ended up becoming the Olympic ski coach for the U.S. Olympic team. And my father ultimately made that ski team and competed in the Winter Olympics in 1956 in Cortina, Italy. So it was a long and circuitous road to winter stardom, but it ended up affecting us and as a family because he moved us to a mountain town later in Idaho. And I became a ski racer. And I think in some ways I attribute his experiences in Scandinavia to contribute, at least partly influencing my later life decision to write about the Arctic.
And when you're choosing a topic about which to write, do you also plan in your research phase to visit these places, and how important to the process is doing that?
Well, that's a great question, and very much so. I mean, I wouldn't say that I choose the topic only so that I can go there, but because I determine that I'm going to go to every place that I write about to the extent humanly possible. During the pandemic, I had one problem because travel was shut down. But other than that, yeah, I try to go at least retrace part or all of the route of the expeditions that I'm writing about. And I think it's been very helpful. You know, obviously you have to consider the time gap between the historical event that I'm writing about and when I'm visiting, which in some cases is many hundreds of years, and in some cases maybe 100 or fewer. But you still gain so much by being on the ground and in some cases in the air over the places that you're visiting to get a kind of topographical and geological and really visceral sense of the place that you're writing about. And it allows me to transport myself in time and kind of imagine what the explorers who were there when they were there on these expeditions were encountering. And I think it really comes through in many cases in being able to describe the landscape, the flora and fauna, and give the reader a kind of explorer's eye view in a way of the events that I'm covering. And so I intend to keep doing it as long as I am physically able to do so.
One of the things that I loved and was fascinated by was some of the sense of or spirit of place in the Arctic, how the five senses take in that landscape. Could you evoke a sense of that if we were to go to one of these places? What might we experience there?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, when you see images of Arctic landscapes, and particularly, maybe of expansive Arctic sea ice, it often looks, flat and, in some ways monochromatic and soundless. But in many cases, it's nothing of the sort. I mean, if you take sea ice as an example, um, there's an incredible amount of noise involved with these giant plates. They're almost tectonic plates of ice, some of them, many, many feet thick and miles and miles and miles long and wide. And when these things collide, you have these cataclysmic eruptions of sound. I mean, cracking and sounds like rifle shots or cannon fire, um, and endless, sometimes almost endless, seemingly endless rumblings, particularly of calving glaciers into fjords and such. And so, yeah, for instance, when for Realm of Ice and Sky, I spent 3 weeks in Svalbard, which is about halfway between northern Norway and the North Pole. And I did a number of expeditionary kind of excursions, including trekking to pretty high mountains, and also um, sea kayaking. And we would try to get ourselves, these were guided trips, but I expressed I wanted to get very near um, calving glaciers into these fjords so I could hear what it sounds like when giant chunks of ice land in these Arctic waters, and the great splashes that occur. Um, and not only that, there's also often, which you don't think of so much, a kind of ongoing cacophony of seabirds and shorebirds and Arctic terns, the chitterings that you hear. And so I try to, whenever possible, um, to incorporate that into the descriptive passages that I'm writing about. I've been very fortunate too, I must say, that most of the books that I've written have included incredible diary and journal and captain log documentation that often include some of those elements, particularly in terms of things like uh, wind speeds and weather. But and those are very helpful. But going there really, I think, sort of highlights that even more, and I'm able to augment what, because in many cases the diarists or the members of the expeditions were writing in incredibly difficult conditions, sometimes in igloos, sometimes at the end of a 15-hour slog over ice, and then they're hunkering into an igloo or tent and writing with seal oil lamp. And I've been very, really amazed by the detail that they do provide. But there are cases in which it's just, you know, what the weather was that day, and what the conditions were like. But yeah, that's a great question. And I really find the Arctic mesmerizing and hypnotic, and in lots of ways addictive,
Hmm.
at least to me.
Well, I've come away from preparing to talk to you and reading about this, far more interested in visiting these places, especially the sea kayaking really appeals to me. I'm interested to ask you about the primary sources. You mentioned the diaries. Do you have to travel to certain places to Italy or Norway or to museums in the north to get your hands on some of these documents, or is uh, in the world we live in today, is it all digitized and you can do it from your workroom right there?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I've been very fortunate in working with numerous libraries and archives um, across the globe, really. But for the last three books which have all had an Arctic um, element to them. The most of the materials have been digitized. Those that haven't been, I in all of my books, I spend a good deal of time thanking librarians in my acknowledgments, because these librarians are just tireless helpers. And sometimes if you for instance, in the previous book to Realm of Ice and Sky, I wrote a book called Empire of Ice and Stone about the Karluk expedition. And one of the main diaries that I wanted was this Scotsman named William McKinley, and his was still it was in handwritten, but then you can pay to have it transcribed. And so in most cases these days, I've been really fortunate to be able to find digitized versions of the diaries, or printed handwritten copies, which have been incredibly useful, particularly when you're dealing with some of the historical figures we're writing, maybe in their native language, but they've also been translated. So that part's getting easier, which allows me to spend more of the time when I do go to the places to be um, out in nature, and mostly trying to experience it in that way. And then I often bring the primary text with me, and I'm reading along while I'm following a particular part of their journey. And that's very fulfilling. I actually started doing that. I wrote a book about the first Europeans to descend the Amazon, and I had the earliest documents that of some of the chroniclers, and I was reading them as I was floating down the Amazon River. And it was I realized this is sort of the way I like to do it.
Yeah, it sounds like a really exciting way to do the research. And I want to ask now about the airships or the dirigibles. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, could could you explain a little about the development of airplanes and airships, and what was the state of technology at that time, and if there was any competition between developing these different forms of air travel?
Yeah, that was one of the things that when I first stumbled onto this story, which these things kind of have a propulsive element, where I didn't know anything about really the airship in the Arctic, um, as I had written my two previous books, and then I came across some article or reference to a book or story, and I was like, wait, I tagged that and made a folder and started, save that for when I finished the previous book. And then I went back to it. But one of the things that really struck me um, about the sort of the heart of the story of Realm of Ice and Sky, in addition to the rather um, just compelling historical figures that populate the book, was that you're right. We were at this really crux moment in history where the airship or dirigible, or some people refer to them as blimps. I mean, there's some really technical differences, but they're not as interesting as the story itself. Um, but we were at a place in history where the dirigible, which was um, a natural offshoot of hot air ballooning, by then putting a motor on it, uh, and the airplane was in its very fledgling development as well. So right at the beginning of Realm of Ice and Sky, I talk a bit about how the Wright brothers in 1903, or at Kitty Hawk, were taking their first really short flights, and I mean, hundreds of feet. And at the same time, over in France and in Europe, the airship, or this essentially a envelope, which is kind of a balloon, a bulbous balloon. Um, the French and the Germans and the Italians were sort of simultaneously working on developing a motorized balloon. And but the airships of the same time as the Wright brothers were actually flying, you know, 10, 20 times farther, well, many times farther, miles instead of feet. Um, and so it was a real question at the moment, which of the two technologies, the airplane or the airship, was going to develop a kind of supremacy of the skies. And the airship, in a lot of ways, had a head start and some major advantages, particularly in the payload element, because an airplane couldn't carry very much, while an airship was able to carry um, a lot more cargo, and also, at the time could go farther. Now, of course, there were detractions on each side too. The airship had the unfortunate possibility, with being inflated with flammable hydrogen, of exploding. Now, I have to say that and I talk a little bit about this near the end of the book, is that, I think I make some offhanded remark that the Hindenburg ruined airship travel for everyone, because there really weren't that many accidents. I mean, the Hindenburgs was just so catastrophic and filmed, and it was recorded. The reports on the radio were live, and so you just had this. You were seeing and hearing about something that really put people off of airship travel, despite the fact that the Graf Zeppelin and other airships had traveled multiple times, across the Atlantic. And so, but yeah, it's a really exciting moment. The book opens with this really exciting moment in history, and it's interesting to note that. I mean, only a few years earlier, a Swede named Solomon Andre had attempted to fly an air balloon to the North Pole from the same place that most of the protagonists in my book attempt to fly from, but he did it without a motor. And so only a few years later, maybe 5 or 6 years later, you've got the technology moving really quickly. And then from the time that Walter Wellman, the first person to try to fly an airship from Svalbard to the North Pole, from his time in like 1906 through 9 until Amundsen tries it, maybe 17 years later, you have this incredible technological advancement where now airships are being used for all sorts of military surveillance capabilities. They're being used for passenger travel. It happened very fast, and it was moving more quickly in ways than well. The airplane was also making great strides too, but yeah, I really love that competitive element. There's sort of a race component to it too, of who's going to make it to the North Pole first, an airship or an airplane. And so it's all pretty exciting.
So building on that, I'm interested to ask you, I can understand why people would want to explore the Arctic for, say, a northwest or a northern passage for a trade route that could limit the time taken to go from one place to another. But what are some of the other motivations that people had for wanting to explore there? Or you talked about this race to get to the Arctic. Is it just for the thrill and of adventure and exploration, or perhaps national pride? I mean, what were some of the things motivating people to go there?
Well, so it's interesting. I think there are, it's a multifaceted rationale. You mentioned national pride. That's one of them. When we're talking about getting to the North Pole first, you know, um, there's a great deal of national pride to that, and people have been trying to do it for a very long time. Um, there's a scientific element involved too, which I think is really important, because we're talking about going someplace that humans had never laid foot before, and so there's a kind of filling out the unknown portions of the map, which were important. Not to mention the meteorological and other geographic, scientific elements of trying to understand, because not long before this was all happening, there was still a belief that um, that the polar sea was sort of this temperate climate, and if you broke through this crust layer of ice, because no one had actually been there, um, and we're talking about only in the early 1900s, that then you would break through this crust of ice and there'd be this open water and this temperate zone. So they were trying to prove or disprove that, not to mention discovery of other land masses that countries were hoping to lay sovereign claim to expand um, global trade and empire. And then it's not insignificant, you know, from an individual standpoint. Um, some of the players who are trying to reach the North Pole, of which there were many. I mean, we're talking about, um, some of my Arctic heroes, Fridtjof Nansen, Amundsen, who's in this book, Robert Peary. There was a great deal beyond national pride. There was, financial gain was significant because if you survive these expeditions and the early ones, there was no guarantee. I mean, there was something like a 50% mortality rate in many, many of these Arctic expeditions. So survival was by no means guaranteed. But if you did survive and came home with a story, you were able to go on lecture tours, write books, and carve out a really pretty significant career as an explorer. And that brings up one of the really most fascinating figures to me in Realm of Ice and Sky is this almost unknown person named Walter Wellman, who is the first American or the first person to try. He happened to be American. To try to fly an airship to the North Pole. Robert Peary had been making attempts in the old-fashioned way with dogs and dog sleds. But Wellman was really interesting because he was a noted American journalist with um, an incredible amount of connection at very high levels of the U.S. government and with all the captains of industry of the time, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and Alexander Graham Bell and Theodore Roosevelt. But Wellman saw the potential of being able to communicate um, through telegram from the Arctic, and also he was sort of a pioneer in trying to report on Arctic exploration in real time. Now, it didn't exactly work out as he had anticipated because of all sorts of complexities, but he did, in fact, send the first telegram from the Arctic, and it ended up all the way at the desk of Theodore Roosevelt. So, that there were multiple reasons for wanting to do that. In hindsight, it's like, well, I think it's much more than sort of Edmund Hillary's famous quote about summiting Everest, because it's there. At the time, there were to fly thousands of miles across the Arctic, the Polar Sea, as it was called, had never been done in it, and you're also able to um, use photography to document places that no humans had ever seen from the air before. So it was quite a big deal, and it's really exciting when you're pouring back over these old New York Times and London Times and all sorts of newspaper articles of the time. I mean, the world was transfixed with what was going to happen. We are still transfixed, I think, and very much intrigued by exploration and discovery. But in this period, there was a lot to explore and discover still.
Well said, yes. I'd like to ask you about Wellman and some of the logistics or realities of attempting to do this. So he would have to get together a crew and one of these airships and take it to Svalbard, and from there attempt to fly to the North Pole. Could you give us a sense of how far is he attempting to fly and then just turn around and come back to the same spot?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the logistical complexities because they were significant. Wellman's crew was actually very small by comparison to later um, attempts by Amundsen and Umberto Nobile, the Italian. But you know, he hired French engineers and designers who were a little bit ahead of everyone else, at least as far as in 1905 and 6, to build these, um, rubberized envelope or what they called the gas bag, which was what contained the hydrogen gas. And it had these built in France. Um, and then he also had, they involve a motor, which in the early days of Wellman's attempts, they were fairly rudimentary. I mean, these are like 75 and 80 horsepower engines, not so powerful. And also then a gondola or basket, which would hang below the airbag and be what the men and cargo would, and potentially dogs, would go inside. Now, all this stuff Wellman would have built in France and shipped to Tromsø, Norway, and then reconvene, make sure everything he had together, and then ship all the way to this place called Donskoya. It's northern Svalbard, Danes Island, and by ship. And then he literally built what was quoted by some journalist at the time, a scientific station in the Arctic. And so he had a cabin built there because for people who have never been up there but can probably imagine, I mean, it's a very short season where everything isn't just covered with snow and ice. It's like 6 weeks. So you're going to have to stay up there or man a kind of village. And so he had like a cabin built with a big shop, and then significantly a large hangar had to be built to house the airship because you're waiting for this perfect weather window. Wellman learned a lot from studying. I mean, the guy I mentioned before, Solomon Andre, who flew off in a balloon and was not discovered for 30 years what exactly happened. But even with a motor, you're waiting for a prevailing wind that is going to take you some 1,000 miles from northern Svalbard north to the North Pole, and you're hoping for a tailwind. And, so the rather rudimentary meteorology of the time was still able to predict with some degree of accuracy, what direction the wind would be blowing, or at least was blowing at the time. And so Wellman's, got to the Arctic, had a crew of people and workers that he had hired in Tromsø, Norway, build this massive hangar, and then, about a 285-foot airship that's going to they're going to board and be towed out a little ways by boat to sea, and then release the lines, and off you go. Wellman, I have to say, he was a little half cocked because he never test flew this airship in France. Timing and money were always tight, and deadlines, and so he was always a little bit behind the 8 ball, as they say, and he was not able to test. So his first attempts were effectively test flights. And, as you can imagine, or as I think I like to phrase it, when you're trying to fly a airship to the North Pole for the first time, what could possibly go wrong? you know, and lots goes wrong.
And the other principal characters of this book, Amundsen and Nobile, they have one trip to the North Pole, and then Nobile tries again with the Italia, and something does go wrong with this one.
Yes.
Could you introduce
Yeah.
just a little bit about who these two characters are as well?
Sure. Yeah. These guys are so, I mean, I had known about Roald Amundsen, um, because he, in my view, is the greatest polar explorer of all time. I mean, um, Shackleton gets all the accolades because, even though that was in Antarctica, but his story is so remarkable because, um, no one dies, and Amundsen, though, he was first to the South Pole, in a race against Scott, Sir Robert Falcon Scott. He was first through the Northwest Passage. Um, and then, in my view, this is all sort of controversial and still argued, but he was technically first expedition leader to the North Pole as well. He was this really tough guy who, read about Franklin's expeditions when he was teen, and even though his mother wanted him to become a doctor and be an academic, he really was just drawn. I mean, he was Norwegian for one thing, so he was drawn. He was from the north, and he was drawn further north, and so he had already his one of his heroes and mentors was this man Fridtjof Nansen, who had previously been the holder of the farthest north. Before anyone made it to the North Pole, the Holy Grail was farthest north, and Nansen had achieved that decades earlier. But Amundsen followed in his footsteps, in his countrymen's footsteps, and became this. Really organized, and he understood elements of um, polar travel that were crucial. One of which is small crews, highly skilled, able to survive, using some indigenous techniques and garb, so that you aren't reliant on bringing thousands and thousands of pounds of food and gear, and so that you can live in a way off the ice. So you've got that guy, Roald Amundsen, who's already, by the time we meet him in the book, he's achieved sort of heroic polar stature, and he essentially comes out of retirement in a way to, um, because what ends up happening is that the American Robert Peary uh, has claimed to have bagged the North Pole, and that happens right as Wellman is attempting another go at it, and so for all intents and purposes, everyone thinks the North Pole has been um, claimed, or it's been is no longer this thing they should aspire to. But by the time Amundsen shows up on the scene, again in about um, 1925, he realizes that while that may be the case that Robert Peary made it to the North Pole, no one has ever flown the entire distance from Svalbard all the way to the North Pole and then on to Alaska across the entire polar sea. And so he sets his goals to do that. And he first attempts to do it in an airplane with an American called Lincoln Ellsworth, which is it's only a chapter in the book, but it's one of my favorites because they end up in dire straits on the ice and have to effect a very unlikely self-rescue, which is just, it's a tremendous feat of survival. Um, and then Amundsen kind of concedes ultimately that Wellman was probably right, that because Wellman had written years before that the airship would solve the mystery of the Arctic and the Polar Sea. And in fact, he was right. And Amundsen decides that by this time, because the dirigible in the mid 1920s has become much more efficient, um, you know, huge, nearly, yeah, a little over 350 feet long, um, much better steering capabilities, much better navigational equipment. And so he ends up agreeing to purchase with the Norwegian Aviation Club an airship that has been designed by Umberto Nobile, who is an employee of Benito Mussolini in his fascist Air Force. And Amundsen doesn't care so much about that. I mean, he's no fan of fascism, but he's getting a good deal on an airship. Now there's a little caveat, which is that the Italians say, well, we'll sell you this airship, but uh, Nobile and at least X number of the crew need to be Italians. And so they make a deal, and Amundsen's okay with that because he figures Nobile designed the airship and knows how to fly it, and the Italian crew knows how to. There's a lot of different moving parts and jobs in flying one of these airships. Men in these um, engine compartments that are on the sides, and you have to have men up in the control cabin, and there's a lot of different jobs that are highly skilled. And so Amundsen, who has really no airship experience himself, but is a great expedition leader and coordinator, says, okay, I'll be the expedition leader. This American guy, Lincoln Ellsworth, will co-lead this, and then Nobile can be the navigator pilot of the airship. And so they make this dramatic flight, and it's one of my favorite uh, parts of the book too, because I've been writing about these things for a few years now, and in almost every case, everything goes catastrophically wrong, and people are, you know, trying to survive on the ice, and sometimes, uh, you know, starving and eating one another, and it's just carnage. But in this particular flight, the Amundsen Ellsworth Nobile transatlantic or transpolar flight goes off uh, almost without a hitch until the end, where they um, reach terrible weather and are in a difficult situation over Alaska and have to make kind of a crash landing. And but then, of course, you had mentioned national pride at the beginning of the chat, and Nobile felt slighted by some of the post-flight coverage that happened. So, as I mentioned, once explorers, are come back to civilization, they scurry to tell the story. And in many cases during this time, they were also being heavily financed by newspapers too, and supported. So there was an expectation that and in some cases, exclusive coverage rights. So when Amundsen got back, there ended up being kind of a lot of bad blood between Nobile and Amundsen about who had uh, done more, been in charge, who was supposed to get the laurels of this unprecedented flight. And so Nobile ends up being so peeved about the whole thing. And when he gets back to Italy, they say, well, let's just do it again, but this time with an almost exclusively Italian crew, and so that we can get the recognition that we deserve that Amundsen has sort of taken from us, right? And that's what um, sort of precipitates this the flight of the Italia, which is an even bigger, badder airship than um, the Norga, which was also Italian made, but the one that Amundsen and Nobile took in 26, and 2 years later, um, Berto Nobile and a mostly Italian crew um, do something that is really, really quite miraculous. So they fly the airship all the way from Milan, Italy, over Russia, all the way to Svalbard, and get there. And by that time, they have set some overland records already. And so Nobile was really meticulous because he's test flying this thing and noting its what it's really good at and where it needs help and work, and doing landing at certain places, and doing some mechanical adjustments on it. And then they finally get to Svalbard, and then uh, Nobile's idea is to do a number of flights. Okay, so we're talking about flying over huge archipelagos that have never been flown over before, and to do research over Franz Josef Land, and so he does a number of pre North Pole flights. Some of which go better than others because of weather and all sorts of other mechanical issues, but they end up deciding to go the first half of the flight. So his plan is to fly to the North Pole, turn around and fly back to Svalbard instead of continuing on, because that had already been done. And the outward flight goes very well. Everything is working perfectly. And I should add that Nobile had really ambitious plans too, to potentially, because one of the benefits of a dirigible is that in certain weather conditions, it's able to hover. So he's got all this big plan of hovering over the North Pole, lowering, and he built it in a contraption, a kind of pulleyed contraption, mechanical, to lower down these rubberized craft, to be able to lower men and equipment to the North Pole surface, and then stay there for a time and take measurements, ice samples, and then retrieve the men back up into the airship, and then go back to Svalbard. When they arrive at the North Pole, the winds are too strong to do to be able to hover and lower the men, so they just turn around. And at this point, there's really bad headwinds, and I wanted to mention too that one of the things that's overlooked is the extent to which sleep deprivation plays a role in some of these problems, because when you're aloft for this long, I mean, Nobile, it's supposed that he was awake for something like 73 consecutive hours, and when the airship crashes. So what happens is, and I don't want to give away the whole book, but they run into some extreme gale force headwinds on the way back, and the airship begins to flounder and lose altitude and visibility, and Nobile sort of loses control of the airship, and they end up on the ice. But I think some of that can be attributed to sleep deprivation, because he was not necessarily able to make all of the best split-second decisions that he needed to pull off these maneuvers. But anyway, the last third of the book deals with this. There were a couple of dozen, nearly 20, I guess, men on the Italia airship, and when it goes down, it's sort of a catastrophic. It doesn't explode, but the gondola is torn from the envelope, and some of the men are violently deposited with great injury onto the ice, while other members of the airship are still up in the rigging inside the airbag, and they sail off into the ether sphere, never to be seen again. And so you've got this moment of real peril. What are they going to do, and how are they going to survive? And coupled with the problem that no one knows exactly where they are, and the ice on which they have been deposited is moving. So it's pretty dramatic.
The image of them floating away up into who knows where, that's not easy to get out of your head, imagining that, and trying to imagine what it must have felt like to be stranded up there and realize there's nothing we can do anymore.
Right. I mean, and you also have, these are your friends and colleagues, and you've been separated, and in fact they see each other. They're all together, and then they see each other. Some of the men in the envelope had the wherewithal to throw out cartons and crates of equipment. Some of it was food, and some of it was a radio, which was which ends up being a really important factor. And then of course, tents and things like that. And so, yeah, that image of them just seeing each other uh, and not knowing whether you're ever going to see them again is pretty intense.
Yeah. So I have one last question I'd like to ask you, and that's about the role of history. So in culture, when we remember technological innovation, or we make note of it, or even take pride in it, and also the role of the historian in going back and looking at archives and being transmitters of these stories. I'd like your thoughts on understanding these people in their time, in their context, and what they were trying to do in the whole process of technological innovation.
Yeah, I'm always, I guess, I'm curious. I'm glad you brought up the placing yourself in the time in which you're chronicling, because where we are now, and we are actually, of course, in the throes of AI, which is going to be a paradigm shifting technology, I'm sure. And but we sort of forget that at a time like in Wellman's time, just the not so long ago, the early 1900s. All of these things like instantaneous communication and flight, um, and the ability to and scientific inquiry and discovery were vital. And so, what I think Wellman, I'm glad you brought him up as a specific example, because I think he gets a lot of discredit for being something of a crackpot who was just trying to go be the first to the North Pole, even if he failed, to kind of get famous for it. But I disagree with that, because he was already famous. He was one of the most famous journalists in America at the time, but he was just writing, he was writing about politics and about the American project. But, his drive was um, technological innovation, and to see how far it could be pushed. And as I mentioned, he was pushing the boundaries of instantaneous communication, which would allow people to, it prefigured, sort of the internet, you could say. Uh, Flight, he was fascinated by flight and its capabilities. He didn't even stop at the North Pole. When he found out that um, Robert Peary had made it to the North Pole, he said, "Well, okay, then I'm going to try to be the first to fly a dirigible across the Atlantic." And not that many years later, like I mentioned, the Graf Zeppelin, humans were flying back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean in these stupefyingly bizarre Jules Verne-looking flying machines. And so, yeah, I think the drive. And so what I'm trying to do when I chronicle these things is balance, telling a great story, but remaining as true and accurate as I can to the history. My audience is typically, these books are called narrative history or popular history, quote, but meaning that they're looking for a more general audience or readership than, say, an academic historical text. But I don't think those two things have to be mutually exclusive. So I try to write the history as accurately as possible and not make up. I don't make up what people say. I don't make up dialogue. I use only um, the archival material, the chronicles, and then um, try to tell the story in a way that y- it's sort of like you were watching it as a film, you know, uh, or reading a really good novel. That's what I'm
Hmm.
hoping happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this book we're discussing is called Realm of Ice and Sky: Triumph, Tragedy, and History greatest Arctic rescue. And I think that part of the subtitle we've left for audiences to go and discover for themselves, which I think is good. So I want to thank you very much for your time today. I've enjoyed talking with you and learning so much from this book. So thank you very much.
Tyrel, it's been my pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on. Thanks so much.